Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the JGLS faculty lecture series. I hope you all are doing great. And today we have Professor Cosmin, who is the Professor of Law and also the Head of Human Mobility and Climate Change Division as a part of the UN Study Center at JGLS. We will be taking questions towards the end of the webinar. So I request you to keep posting the questions in the comment section. Over to you, Professor.
Okay. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is safe. And despite the challenging times we are facing, you are enjoying home as much as possible after such a long lockdown. So today we're going to talk about climate change law and policy. Apparently, I'm going to talk to you around 30-40 minutes, and then you are free to ask your questions on the chat. So as you know, my name is Cosmin Corendea. I work for Jindal Law School, now probably in transition to the new Jindal Environmental and Sustainability School. Let's see how that goes. And I am teaching, among others, climate change law and policy. So just to set up the bar, I'm pretty sure that all of you who are attending this seminar are aware of climate change, and more than that, I'm pretty sure that climate change existence is not debatable. So even if we have some people who do not believe in climate change, you just have to look around and see the changes in the atmosphere and the meteorological threats we are increasingly facing. And more than that, to actually try to live over these high temperatures, warmest and warmest years come one after another, sea level rise, salinization, desertification, and all the effects climate change has on us. As you all know, climate change temperature started to be measured around the 18th century, the middle of 18th century, and since then, unfortunately, due to industrialization, mainly at the beginning or at the end, beginning of 20th century, the temperature started to increase, and they are uniformly increasing even now. However, if before industrialization, the temperatures were just in a natural mechanism. Now, apparently, the temperatures are increasing due to our contribution, and this is called anthropogenic. And due to these anthropogenic changes, where the man is actually inducing changes in nature, we are actually facing today probably the biggest threat of our century and the biggest challenge for the new generations to actually deal with in the future, which is called climate change or global warming. It's not a difference of language, not necessarily, it's just a difference of understanding how you're actually perceiving the change of the climate, the change of the environment in general. And or if you are looking only at the main effect, which is actually the increasing in high temperatures, and that will be warming, a global warming, not uniformly. In some places of the world, climate change is more felt, to be felt by people than in other places of the world. But it does not mean that it will not happen there as well. So it's just a matter of when, and it's not a matter of if. In this regards, climate change is a law topic. It's quite new. We had different environmental topics since the beginning of the 20th centuries. We had some very famous trials which took place at the beginning of 20th century. And then in 1972, we had the first United Nations conference on environment, which was held in Stockholm, and which actually represented the first global implication of all the people in relation to the changing environment. So at the middle of the 20th century, people started to observe that the environment is changing. And because of the industrialization, as I said before, it did not necessarily, people were not paying attention very well actually to the environment. So they were for development. They didn't take care of the environment properly. And then the United Nations felt the need to actually address that at the global level. And this is when the Stockholm Declaration happened in 1972, as I told you, which actually set up the bar for very high standards for environment in relation to law and in relation to international law. So in 1972, we had set up a very strict and very idealistic, if you want, principles of law, which later became principles of environmental law, and were adopted by most of the countries within their constitution. Very few countries in the world didn't actually take that on board. So the principle, do not harm, for example, do not harm your neighbor, do not harm your environment when you are actually are accessing natural resources, for example. The principle polluter pays, for example, it's another principle you even can Indian law as well, and you know, you have a lot of legiferenda, you have a lot of jurisprudence which is addressing these principles. So after they set up the bar, the governments around the world started to import these principles. Some of them, as I said, in their national legislation, some of them directly adopting different international agreements, conventions, or treaties, which actually allow them to be part of this global movement of protecting the environment. In 1988, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change appeared, that scientist body which took the Oscar title a few years back, and also the Nobel Prize. And this body of scientists, around at the beginning were around 100, now it's around 250 scientists, as a merger of WHO, which is so much in the news today, and UNEP, which is the United Nations Environmental Program, which now is called simpler United Nations Environment, which has the headquarters in Nairobi in Kenya. And as I said, in 1988, the IPCC appeared as a request to address particularly climate change, because in 1972 climate change was not an issue, so it was not properly addressed. As I said, we set up the principles. We were regarding to the nature, to giving rights to the nature, giving rights to the environment, protecting the environment. However, 1972 as the first show-off didn't actually focus necessarily on climate change. In between 1972 and 1988, we have the ozone layer, which was another environmental global problem we faced, and due to some reduction in using some specific gases, which were actually the main cause for the ozone layer to actually create holes. Apparently 1 year back, the ozone layer recovered completely. So even if we had that good example to look at and a good practice, and the scientists solved the issue quite easily, not affecting the development so much, because the specific gas was to be found in air conditionings, in refrigerators, and we still have refrigerators and you are still using air conditioning. However, with that specific harmful gas, which was causing the effects of ozone layer. Now, even despite this good practicing, I was saying, it doesn't mean that climate change is to be solved immediately, or to be solved only taking only several measures. Apparently, the scientists proved in the reports coming from the IPCC that even if you stop today polluting, if you first stop today contributing to climate change, unfortunately, the sea level rise will continue, the increase in temperature will continue, the salinization, desertification, coastal erosion, and everything else associated with climate change will actually increase as well. Also, the meteorological events like the hurricanes and typhoons and cyclones is not a matter of, it was proved scientifically that the climate change is not contributing to the increase in the number of the events during 1 year, but the increase in intensity. So intensity of the cyclones and hurricanes and all the meteorological events in general, starting from rain, floods, and so on, will actually, unfortunately, increase and will continue to increase, even if we stop today or we stop tomorrow or contributing to climate change. This shows that it's a continuous problem, and in law, when you have a continuous problem, you also need a continuous solution. We try to have different answers to climate change. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change came alive in 1992, started trying to regulate the change of the climate, as the name it is, and later on, as an outcome, as the main outcome, basically on climate change, came the 2015 Paris Agreement. Despite these progresses, slow progresses from 1992 to 2015, and now we are trying to actually implement the Paris Agreement and make it operational at a domestic level, at country level. Despite these progresses, the problem, as I said, needs to have some continuous solutions, and is not enough. It shows that is not enough, and man and humankind has to take more measures in order to actually address this phenomenon, and try to address it as fast as possible, because the consequences or the models the scientists actually are projecting are not very very positive. If you are doing a very simple exercise and you are Googling and you are looking at the world map after climate change by 2050 or 2100, you're gonna see that all the world map as you know it is crippled, and most of the countries, including India or a big part of South India, will actually disappear under the waters. So if this continues in the way it does today, and in the way that every year, as I said at the beginning, is becoming warmer and warmer, the pollution didn't stop. We have this debate between now north and south. It shows only that these projections will become alive. And fortunately for us, nature itself, if you want, or some extra territorial force, whatever you want to call that, took care of that and showed us that during, for example, during the pandemic, you had a lot of recovery in the environment in general around the world. We had a slow on ice melting. We had, for example, in different parts of the world, having the marine life coming back to life after so many years. So you have a lot of positive outcome coming from this coronavirus, which we are still facing today. And even if it's not human-centered, obviously, the environment, however, is somehow generally benefiting from this period where you don't have so many flights, when you don't have so much industrialization taking place, when you don't have so much developing happening, and actually when the time stopped for the world for the last 3 months. And this actually may represent a solution. I mean, I'm not saying that the pandemic is a solution, but I'm saying that stopping these events for a while could actually contribute to some kind of refreshing or regeneration of environmental in general, and some kind of slowness of climate change phenomenon around the world. It's not necessarily obviously it takes a lot, because people are not allowed to travel, and you don't have people losing. They have a lot of economic impacts, obviously, negative economic impacts. But it also showed that the environment, when it's left alone, without the intrusion, without the contribution of people in general, the environment, the nature is actually recovering itself, and it has this power to recover itself quite in a very significant short of time. If you are thinking that in only 3 months, for example, you started to see different species of fish reappearing, you see that the environment it's more greener, and even the events around the world are not so many anymore. It's a paradox, if you ask me, and but again, it's maybe a small part of the answer we are all looking for in order to find a solution for climate change. Coming back to law, after 1992, when I told you that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change appeared, we have different developments in that regards, with development of national adaptation plans, national determination contribution of countries, the loss and damage as another subject, which is also reflected in the Paris Agreement. And it ended up, if you want, this process of development in 2015 with the Paris Agreement, one of the most developed environmental agreements in the world, mostly abundant in human rights, is the most environmental agreement in the world which has a lot of human rights captured. And now we are trying to come from the phase of observing the Paris Agreement, if you want, in the last 5 years, to the implementation phase, when countries actually have to start implementing the requirements which they agreed in Paris in 2015. It's a slow process. Obviously, it's a slow process, and it's a sovereign issue, if you want. We were talking yesterday about sovereignty of the states in choosing the way they are actually dealing with these issues, and it shows also that a lot of countries around the world are quite reluctant towards letting this Paris Agreement taking over the national legislation and somehow contributing to protecting environment and addressing the challenges of climate change. But at the same time, people are quite reluctant because they see that there, as I said, the development, the economic opportunities, and everything related to the daily life is actually negatively affected. And when I say that it's affected, it's not a matter of change of lifestyle, but it's a matter of changing the life we are used to have, or we are actually having these days. So it's much more easier to give up a life we are used to have these days, and we show that we are even capable and so adaptable to actually stay indoors for 2 months or 2 months and a half, 3 months or so, how long this will take in regards to COVID-19. But it also shows that it's a matter of will. It's a matter of political will. It's a matter of individual will. So this is where law, it's actually bringing it to the table, but it's the people who actually need to come to the table and actually take it and use it, because environmental law in general, it's abundant in jurisprudence, it's abundant in legislation, international environmental law. We have over 1,000 environmental agreements in the world, treaties, conventions, bilateral agreements, understandings, and so on. Over 1,000 is the most developed part of international law so far. And my rhetorical question to you will be, how many do you know? How many actually countries are working with? And this is again mirroring the individual / political will, which I just mentioned a few minutes back. So in this regard, law is there, but we also have to make sure that we are taking advantage of it, and we are using it at its own potential. And trust me, the Paris Agreement may be imperfect, but it's a very good step to have, and it's a very good agreement to have. And if it's not binding, as you may know, technically it's an annex to a COP decision, to a Conference of Parties decision from Paris, which is under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. So this is part of the regularly work, but it has treaty language, and it also has, even if it doesn't have so many teeth, it still shows that is not welcomed by most of the countries which believe that these environmental treaties and Paris Agreement in particular would actually affect their development. So even when it's not binding, even when it does not have so many teeth, still it represents a threat for the governments to consider when it's coming to regulating climate change. Obviously, if this is barely possible, imagine if we had an understanding which would have been binding upon states. I know it sounds ideal, but if states didn't agree or are quite reluctant towards something which is not so binding over them, imagine what the reaction of the states in general, of the countries in the world, will be in regards to their to something which has more force, which has more strength. And obviously, you also are aware of some countries which even stepped out of this Paris Agreement without it, not so perfect, will not being non-binding and so on, but still I'm not sure if I'm audible, if you can still see
Yes,
me.
yes, Professor, you're audible. You can carry on with the lecture now.
Okay, I apologize for that. Apparently,
Yeah,
climate
it's
change
okay.
just interrupted.
Yeah. It's okay.
Okay, yes. So, in the second part, after this interruption, I apologize again for that. I would like to talk to you about some impacts of climate change, in particular to our lives. So, it was since 2007 that when climate change phenomenon appears, actually the first impact from the legal perspective will be some kind of human rights infringement, some human rights violation. So someone somehow somewhere has his or hers human rights affected by these effects of climate change. I usually use the example of floods because we are all familiar with the floods, regardless where we find ourselves in the world. And when a flood is coming, you're going to have a family or a community affected by by the floods, and this is infringing on the human rights, for example. So effects also on climate change, on human rights. So from this perspective, it was the relationship is clear, and it goes even further that today you cannot talk about human rights without referring to climate change as one of the triggers of human rights violations, as you can talk about climate change without referring to human rights. This creating an interlinkage, this creating the interconnectivity between the two concepts, between the two phenomena from the legal perspective. So the court started to analyze firstly, and you see that the most jurisprudence which you have today in relation to climate change is taken from a human rights perspective, mainly because the human rights segment in international law is very abundant in domestic legislations as well, most of them. But and more than that, it shows that it's related to the impact, is related directly to the impacts of climate change. If you go the extra step, then you're going to find that the secondary effects of the subsidiary effects of human rights violation, once that families of human rights are affected, then they actually have two choices. The household has two choices. The first choice will be to adapt, and this is when we go in adaptation. And this is when, for example, the Paris Agreement or all the COP decisions which were taken so far under UNFCCC are addressing adaptation and mitigation as solution for addressing climate change. But this actually requires, from the legal perspective, a high capacity of the state to assist. If you want to adapt, if you want to be able to send a child to the school who is affected by flooding, you need to provide some boats, for example, or you need to provide some alternatives like online education, which you all are having today, just because you need somehow to create opportunities for the people to adapt. If the state is weak or it does not simply has the capacity to assist, then probably the adaptation solutions, opportunities which are in place for that respective affected community people are very less. So this is one of the choices they have. And the second choice is when this adaptation is not possible anymore, or the impact is very strong, in particular to human rights, then the people are fleeing. The people are leaving that specific place and they are going temporarily or permanently to another place until the house, until their origin, the place of origin is actually recovering. So it goes in mobility, it goes in displacement, in forced migration, where people are forced to be to migrate. And a study from 2016 actually showed that 30% of the people worldwide who are affected by climate change, implicitly having their human rights infringed, violated, actually are choosing to migrate. And this shows that the number of the states to assist is decreasing instead of increasing, while this number of people deciding to actually leave is increasing. So the measurements are continuing today, and people are preferring sometimes to actually leave their houses and leave their livelihood and everything behind it just for safety, just for security. And this is not necessarily a good indicator for people to have, mainly because they are not willing to go. Also, the research which was conducted for so many years shows that the people do not want to move. They barely want to move from their own habitat. So once they are forced to move and they are becoming displaced people, their effects of climate change are actually recurring in this human mobility segment when people are migrating and they're facing another challenges and another human rights violations internally, cross-border, really doesn't matter, but their challenges continue. So all these three elements were actually analyzed under a concept of law which is known as hybrid international law, which actually shows that this relation between the three, between environment or climate change impacts, human rights, and migration or displacement in particular, are actually again interconnected. You have a lot of people who are fleeing these days. You have around 30 million people who are fleeing annually their their houses due to climate change or disaster when you have natural hazards, or disasters when have some kind of human component inside, so when the people actually contributed to that disaster. Yeah, so if you are taking and do a simple math, it will show that every second like this, one person is actually leaving their house to find other solutions to live and to stay safe when they're actually confronting climate change or disaster or natural hazards. In general, environmental degradation, if you want, as a more inclusive concept of all of them. So the increased number of the people who are actually migrating, it's another form of concern, because instead of having one problem, and that will be climate change, then you have another problem, which are the human rights violations in relation to that climate change impact. And more than that, you have people starting to being forced to migrate again due to this two, which I mentioned before. So it's a cause-effect kind of relationship. But instead of having one problem, you have more problems, and actually governments and states is trying to better instead of trying to adapt, instead of trying to address the adaptability of affected communities and people, they're actually facing now multiple problems. And this is contributing to the global displacement in the world, again, which is increasing. The number of refugees going to 60 million a year, and we all know their state of life, which is not very positive, and which is actually reflected sometimes wrongly, if you ask me, in the media. And more than that, it's actually contributing to affecting the receiving communities as well. And it's a very complex process, and unfortunately it's happening. And although the IPCC tried to address that, they had in 2019 they had a report on ocean and geosphere, and when they call this mobility of people, in particular this displacement, is calling it they are calling it retreat, people retreating from the adverse effects of climate change. And more than that, besides displacement, you also have started to have relocation, permanent relocation of people, where people are moving their houses and their entire livelihood to another places, mainly because, for example, you had climate change impacts on the coast of the countries by having erosion, salinization, intrusion of salt water, and impacts of hurricanes, of typhoons, which are very strong on the coast. More than that, you also have the lack of the affecting of economic opportunities, like fishing, which is actually decreasing around the world, and it showed that all the countries are facing problems with fishing. So this shows again another movement of people, forced movement of people to actually try to find solutions for their own lives. This is in a nutshell. I think I am supposed to stop here. This is in a nutshell some kind of introduction for climate change law and policies. Obviously at Jindal we are having this class taught in the law school, but also now Jindal established a new school of environmental sustainability, which it will actually even address more the climate change impacts taken by each and every component of climate change policies, for example, in energy, emissions trading, disasters, as I said, migration, human rights, and so on, taking one by one and analyzing it in a more sociological and scientific way than legal. But also the law school offers this class, and climate change law in general, it's a new topic. It started to be developed in less than 10 years. 10 years ago, it was not such a subject of climate change law, but apparently, and unfortunately, on the same time, if you ask me, this topic starts to be more and more abundant in subjects and topics to be discussed and debated. And more than that, it's actually showing the interest of the people, especially the students, the young people, to have a glimpse, to have an understanding of what is happening in relation to this phenomenon, for them to be better equipped in order to address this challenge we're facing. So I thank you so much, all of you, for your attendance, and Now I'm ready to receive the questions.
Yes, Professor, thank you so much. That was a really enlightening lecture by you. So we come towards the second part of our webinar where we ask questions. So the first question is asked by Shobna. She says that waste is another major problem for climate change. So do you think that having more stringent waste management rules will help in curbing the climate change issues?
Yes, definitely. Waste management, actually, it's a huge problem, but not only in relation to climate change, in relation to environmental in general. We have a lot of treaties and agreements in international environmental law which are regulating waste, and especially waste transfer from one country to another, especially the waste which is has the most component of the waste is plastic. And as we know, plastic, it takes some hundreds of years to actually be absorbed by the soil, compared with some other components of the same material or other materials to replace our plastic usage, and which is taking less, maybe a few months or not even so, in order to be absorbed and approved, if you want, by the land in general. And in regards to waste, countries start to have their own management. Unfortunately, you have a lot of examples which were used by other countries to transfer waste from one part to another, especially the e-waste. There were some cases where countries were receiving, as part of their development, from other countries assistance in receiving computers, for example, but old generation computers, which they were happy because they will have access, or they will have had the opportunity to access the internet and the computing in general in schools. And for a very short period of time, that was a very good trade, if you want. However, it showed that in a few years, those old generation computer became very quickly e-waste. And unfortunately, e-waste, you cannot transfer it to another countries. You cannot get rid of it outside your borders. So you have to deal with that. And you see that sometimes in light of development, countries are developing strategies only on short term, instead of having thinking of a long term, and thinking of what are we going to do with all these old generation computers if we are importing them. We're going to have internet and computing in schools for 5 years, but after 5 years, we're going to face another problem, and that will be the e-waste problem. And also in regards to waste, there are many countries which started to develop their own legislation in regards to banning plastic usage. And this was initiative. It's also present in the north and in the south. That countries started not to use plastic bags in supermarkets anymore, and so on and so on. But as I said from the beginning of this session, it's a matter of individual choice. It's a matter of individual contribution, and obviously of political will for the states to actually develop this kind of policies, which will allow some kind of waste regulation and management in favor of, in the way that it addresses climate change as well.
Professor, the next question is asked by Meghna Shetty. She's asking, is it legally possible to make certain situations permanent? For instance, work from home or online classes to help the climate change crisis?
Well, if you like online classes, then it might be a solution. You have a lot of online education taking place around the world. However, I believe that is somehow a little extreme, that schooling should take place only online. I believe that the relationship between the professor and the student, or the capacity of the student to accumulate knowledge, is much more present when it has a physical contact, when they're face to face, they're in the class, and they're actually learning better than online. But it is a solution. It is a solution. Again, unfortunately, it's not possible all over the world. You have a lot of countries, as well as less developed countries in the world, which internet options are not so well developed. and students are not even able to stay home. So now we have this crisis of COVID-19, which slowly, unfortunately, is moving to Africa, and the impacts in Africa will be much more damaging than the impact which had in the north, or even in the country, on some countries in the south, mainly because, for example, the students will be required to go to school, but when they are going home, they do not have these internet options. So again, it's a matter of governments to find solutions, but to permanentize that education, I mean, again, it's a matter of choice. You can actually have your own choice and have online classes and online schooling permanently, but I believe that this should be one of the last resort solutions, if you ask me, to be found by people in order to address climate change. When you have so many other challenges and threats at our hands, in front of our eyes, which are much easier to be addressed than online schooling.
Professor, the next question is asked by Neeraj Nachiketa. He asked that island nations like Fiji has taken proactive steps in dealing with the climate-induced migration. Other island nations in practice are also moving in such directions. But island nations in the Indian Ocean taking actions not at that level. What is your opinion on this?
Well, you have to actually start each country, regardless where their geographical position is in the world, they should start thinking of policy development. It was proved that this national/regional approach in regards to policy development is much more effective than having some kind of global policy development. Obviously, the global policy development, for instance, at the UN level, has its own merit. However, it shows that the effectiveness of things happening, of actually countries taking further steps towards different problems, it's more effective at the regional level. So the island nations in the Pacific try to address these climate change challenges at the regional level firstly, and now individually, because they develop their own capacity to develop policies. And I believe that in regards to Indian Ocean in general, countries should also start being very proactive in the regional approach, trying to see the regional problems in regards to climate change, and not only, and then from that step to move forward and try to develop their national legislation. Again, unfortunately, I have to emphasize it every time, based on individual/political will. But Maldives, it's as far as I know, it's very active in regards to policy development. They did not reach that level of developing their own policies in regards to climate change outside the UNFCCC framework. But I'm pretty sure all the countries, because the island nations are on the front line of combating climate change, they are starting to thinking more proactively within their own territories and in the region.
Professor, the next question is asked by Vani. She says that what should be preferred, mitigation or adaptation after the COVID-19 with regard to climate change scenario right now?
Well, I'm not sure how COVID-19 is actually affecting climate change. If you are, I mean, COVID-19, as I said in my intervention, actually forced countries to somehow adapt to a new solution, to a new problem, which was a pandemic. And when adapting to that problem, they implicitly, somehow, without even their will, started to solve a little bit of the other problem, which will be climate change. So I think the solution is both adaptation and mitigation. I think the mitigation should continue, although you have a lot of litigation which comes around now and is popping up around the world, and you see society being more active. You see the children movement. You have students. You have whistleblower like Greta, which is taking the floor and being more active in litigation, where the states actually have to respond somehow, and the response is that they are to blame. You see that the judgments on climate change are becoming more and more flexible, becoming more and more oriented towards states becoming more active. So I think both of them, mitigation and adaptation, but also, if you ask me, as a lawyer, litigation may be also a solution when the states are not actually so responsive.
Professor, the next question is by Neeraj. He asks that how can we link economic development with climate change induced migration and human rights violations?
Economic development, this is what you said?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Economic development is affected by human rights violations. If you have a human rights approach, a human-centric approach, you're gonna notice that some rights are not necessarily favorable to development, or not to non-ordinary development, if you want. So this development is affected because you have to somehow preserve the human rights instead. If you are thinking of the right to development towards the right to clean environment, this is an ongoing debate on regards to which prevails, is the chicken or the egg, which is more important to develop as a state. If you ask the states, they will say yes, for us it's important to develop, or to actually the ring to clean environment. And then if you go to the individuals, probably the most answer would be around the right to clean environment. So it's a continuous debate. And how migration is affecting the economic development? Well, it's affecting tremendously, because countries have very limited resources in general, and when they are receiving extra people, or their regions of the countries, when they are overpopulated due to forced migrants or forced migration coming from climate change effects, from climate change triggers, then the economic solutions are decreasing. So more population you have, or more people coming within on the same amount of resources, obviously it's increasing even conflict. Sometimes you have a lot of conflict which started to take place around the world due to access to natural resources, and the access to natural resources not mainly because the people do not have access to natural resources, but the number of people increased so fast and so much that the resources became limited for all of them. So I think it's an interrelation, it's a relationship between all of them. And once you address climate-induced or climate-related migration or mobility in general, probably the economic opportunities would actually grow.
Professor, the next question is being asked by Bhavya. She says, why are the international treaties on environment not binding? And what can the youth do about it?
Well, not all of them are not binding. Paris Agreement, as I told you, technically it's an annex to a COP decision, to a Conference of Parties decision, which is actually under the UNFCCC. The solution was induced by the United States, paradoxically, because the government of Barack Obama wanted not to pass the Paris Agreement through the Congress. Every piece of international legislation the United States is signing, it's due to be subject to debate in the Congress, because the government Obama did not have the Congress majority. They wanted to overpass that. So that's why technically Paris Agreement, it's a COP decision, but it's an annex to a COP decision. But these COP decisions are part of the process under UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is actually a binding instrument. And you have a lot of other binding instruments like UNCCD, the United Nations Convention on Combat Desertification, like the Rio Declaration and the Rio Conventions from 1992, and the one on biodiversity. All of them are binding upon states. Some of them had some reservations, some of them stepped out, unfortunately, for these binding agreements, but this is only at the UN level. You also have at individual level, at the bilateral and or regional levels, you have a lot of other environmental instruments, environmental legal instruments for the states to use, and they are usually binding. When you have a bilateral treaty, both parties are bound by the treaty. Otherwise, it's just an understanding, and I don't see the purpose of having a legal understanding between two countries if the two countries do not want to be subject to the objective of that respective treaty. So usually, in when you have, this is why I said that the regional approach sometimes works better, because it's much easier to negotiate with 32 or 38 countries from the Pacific, for example, instead of 197 countries from the UN. So I'm pretty sure, because they are facing the same problem, because they are sharing the same values, because they are having the same traditions, their understanding of the process in general, it's much more efficient, is much more correct than at the UN level. And then based on that, you are developing a Kampala Convention. Again, it's even if it's not an environmental instrument, it has an environmental component, and that's a binding instrument. It's a binding treaty as well.
Professor, the next question is being asked by Mikey. She says, in the recent years, the sources behind the animal husbandry, such as extensive deforestation, use of gallons of water, has emerged as a cause of disruption of environment and natural resources. Along with other policies, shouldn't policies be made to regulate the use of such materials under the animal husbandry industries?
Well, it should. Now we have a voluntary process apparently coming from for merchandising, for the fashion industry, I think it's called, which is actually taking some proactive steps in regards to climate change and in regards to usage of materials which are coming or are coming from sources which are not environmental friendly. Obviously, this is just a voluntary step which was taken by some organizations, but not all the organizations are actually respecting these animal rights, or they are not respecting the environmental rights in general, in particular when it's coming to forest deforestation. So when it's coming to the decision of people, is not necessarily regulated at the governmental level, but it's more of an industry initiative. And although it should be regulated by the states in general, it also says that sometimes, as I said, the right to develop is much stronger present in the minds of the people who are deciding this of the lawmakers, if you want, of policy developers, than the right to clean environment or the right to protect the environment in general.
Professor, the next question is asked by Bhanu Pratap Singh. He says he has a query related to human rights perspective. While the Paris Agreement constitutes a step forward for advocacy of climate change and human rights, but the non-inclusion of a reference to the human rights in Article 2 of the Paris Agreement, isn't it the same as a step-back approach from the human rights perspective and making the agreement more a climate-centered regime?
Well, it is a climate center document. It is under the UNFCCC, and it should be a climate change center document. But it's more abundant. What I said, it was that it's more abundant in human rights. It's the most abundant environmental treaty in human rights when it's coming to human rights. To protecting of human rights. Yes, you have Article 8, for example, but most importantly, although it's not operational, but when you are thinking of the entire Paris Agreement as not being binding or having not so much operational teeth, then you should also look at the preamble. The preamble, it's abundant in human rights, starting from indigenous rights to migrants' rights, related to right to health, and so on and so on. More than that, based on the Paris Agreement, as I said, with the three components, environmental, human rights, and migration, you started to have a lot of activity at the Human Rights Council, which is belonging to the High Commissioner for Human Rights from the United Nations. And the Human Rights Council started to come up with decisions, and the last one was taken last June in 2019, when it's actually moving the discussion of climate change, which was initiated by the Paris Agreement, Climate Center, indeed, it's moving the discussion to a human rights fora where the people are trying to address the climate change within a human rights context. And the work continues, and I'm pretty sure as IOM or the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, move the discussion of climate change under their own fora and started to look at climate change from their own perspective, from the mobility perspective. I'm pretty sure that the work which started by Mary Robinson, the former Irish president, who actually took initiative in this regard, it will continue under the Human Rights Council. And the Human Rights Council decision, and even the new one from January in regards to a case from the Pacific, Ethiopia, it's actually showing that and when the Human Rights Council tried to correct a decision of a court from New Zealand, it's actually showing a very much progress in regards to recognizing climate change as a human rights issue.
Professor, with this, we come to the last question. The last question is asked by Neeraj again. He is asking that many nations have domestic disaster management litigations as per the Sendai framework. How climate-induced disasters can be integrated to disaster management at the national level?
Well, I think the LLM program actually even this year, LLM program from Jindal with WWF actually somehow helped in some regards, in a very small piece, but very significant piece, the development of policies of countries in relation to climate management within their national disaster management. And obviously they are overstepping one over another. There are two topics which are very difficult to be separated, mainly because disasters towards natural hazards are very difficult to be recognized separately in general. But during the LLM program we had the Jindal this year, we developed some kind of guidelines for the island nations to actually help implementing these climate change policies within their national legislation, eventually under the domestic disasters management organization which they have there. So it is possible, and I think it's the next step for these disaster agencies, governmental agencies around the world who are already working, and you have a different disaster management of disaster risk reduction management chain, if you want, around the world, with all the governments developing that particular area, taking on board some of the climate change issues. But again, it's important to separate between sudden onset or slow onset events about climate change event and natural hazards. It's important not mainly because of separation of language and legal understanding, legal better understanding, but also because sometimes people are becoming confusing and they have the same solution from two different problems. And this should not be the case.
Thank you so much, Professor. With this, we come towards the end of our webinar today. I would request you to give an end note to all the attendees related to the topic or in general.
Okay, so for the people from India, from the prospective students of India, please come and join us at the Jindal Law School or in our regular school, or if you want to take a master in environment, you should consider the LLM program we have with WWF. This is where you have theory and practice put together, and students facing probably very attractive subjects to deal with, policy development, legal norms development, and many other issues, as well with the new school which we have at Jindal, the Jindal Global School on Environmental Sustainability, which starts its classes this fall, and which actually unveil even more from not only from the legal perspective, but also from the social perspective, from the cultural perspective, some economic perspective as well, these issues of climate change and environmental degradation in general. So if you want to learn more, that will be a good path to follow. If you are looking at Jindal from around the world in general, Jindal is continuing to contributing to policy development in regards to climate change / human rights / human mobility at domestic level, trying to help as much as possible academically and practically the governments to take the best solutions around the world. So stay tuned for unveiling our work on that. So again, thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to hearing more from you in the future.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. It was indeed a very enlightening session by Professor Cosmin. I also thank all the attendees for joining us. Hope to see you in the next webinar that we'll be having on Thursday. Till then, stay safe, stay home. Thank you and bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you. Stay safe all. Bye-bye.